The economic arms race between the United States and China is inevitable, and this will primarily affect the production of microelectronics. Washington has already shown they will pursue any way, including non-market ones, to win this race, an American tactic to stay on top, even at the expense of others. The U.S. Department of Commerce has put some new restrictions on the sale of semiconductor technologies to China. These restrictions will prevent companies from selling microchips used in artificial intelligence and supercomputing. Stay till the end to learn how America is currently ahead of China in the semiconductor war. Let's discuss how it all started in the first place. In 2012, an engineer named Yu left his job at ASML, the only company in the world that used to make a machine capable of producing the most advanced semiconductor chips in the world. He decided to go solo and started two of his own companies, one based in the U.S. and the other in China. There were several allegations that he recruited other engineers from ASML to his U.S.-based company, and they brought stolen information about machines, and it was all backed by the Chinese government. This story is just a small piece of China's efforts to transform the semiconductor industry while being in a constant struggle with the U.S. You would be shocked to know that this semiconductor war between China and the U.S. isn't about market share or revenues. It's about power. So how exactly did China and the U.S. enter into a Cold War over microchips? In 1958, engineers in the United States invented the first semiconductor chip, and since then, semiconductors have improved at an exponential rate. The founder of Intel, Gordon Moore, predicted in 1965 that the computing power produced by a single chip would double every year, and the stats seem to back his claim. Let's look at the graph, which might give a clearer picture. In the initial stages, the semiconductor chips were basically made by only U.S. companies, and they were sold to a single customer, the U.S. government. The chips were mainly used in guidance computers in NASA spacecraft, as well as in missile systems. The U.S. government was only linked with these companies because they had the most advanced chips and were improving every year. They had a firm belief that the computing abilities of a nation determined its power on the world stage. Advanced computing was used to crack codes in World War II and track Soviet submarines during the Cold War. These U.S. companies used to control the entire supply chain. They used to design, manufacture, and assemble them into a package for installation into a product. It was not until the late 1960s that the companies decided to expand their supply chain by designing chips for civilian products, such as corporate computers. And why not? They would make more money and have access to technology from the rest of the world this way. They only needed to ensure that their chips were inexpensive and plentiful. Most of these companies moved their setups to Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea, where labor was cheap and manufacturing and assembling the product was no big deal. What's fantastic is that the U.S. government backed them in this endeavor because the countries were either U.S. allies or partners, so it was a simple way to support their economies and deepen ties. In order to keep rivals behind, the U.S. government banned these chip companies from sharing technology with the Soviet Union and China. On the contrary, these allied governments decided to invest in their own chip companies to compete with the rest of the world. By 1980, Toshiba from Japan and Samsung from South Korea had developed chips that could rival American chips. In the 1990s, a Taiwanese company named TSMC manufactured next-generation chips that were, if not more, as advanced as the American chips. The U.S. companies knew that they were not the only ones who could make the most advanced chips anymore. But unlike America, every other country was reliant on other countries for the hardware equipment and software required to make the complex chips. While the U.S. and its allies were improving technology every year, China was lagging. During the rule of dictator Mao in the 1960s and 70s, several scientists and engineers left China. A few decades later, new Chinese leaders pushed to catch up. After the Cold War ended, the U.S. became friendly with China and lifted the bans. The Chinese government invested in major companies of the world to move their assembly operations to China, and by the 2000s, they started to dominate the supply chain. The Chinese government knew that its entire tech ecosystem relied on imported silicon from other countries, such as Japan, Taiwan, and the US. As a result, they decided to invest in their own chip design and manufacturing companies in the hope of developing a completely Chinese supply chain. Soon, China could design, manufacture, and assemble its own chips, but it was still years away from making the more advanced ones. The only problem was that there were only 3 companies who could make the software needed to design advanced chips, and all of them were in the US. Besides, these designs could only be converted into real chips by a machine made by ASML. Apart from America, only Taiwan and South Korea had everything they needed to make advanced processor chips. They were considered choke points in the supply chain, and China completely relied on them. In the year 2019, American police released an arrest warrant for Yu, but they could not find him. He was working as the CEO of his own company in China, which made software similar to that of ASML, considered IP theft. There had been several IP thefts in the chip industry, and the Chinese government had been supportive of some of these because they realized that their companies were very much weaker than the competitors. You'd be surprised to learn that China was looking at choke points like ASML and copying them to become less dependent on foreign supply chains. However, the plan backfired vigorously. The U.S. government, along with some other governments, was annoyed by China, and they decided to take China's subsidiaries as a more security-focused issue rather than an economic one. The relationship between the U.S. and China was becoming more competitive every year. In 2018, the Trump administration decided to ban U.S. companies from selling components to ZTE, a Chinese tech company. Later in 2019, they prohibited the companies from having any relationships with China's biggest tech company, Huawei. After these restrictions, ZTE was nearly bankrupt, whereas Huawei also suffered a very significant blow. When Joe Biden became president of the U.S., he targeted the Chinese chip industry. In 2022, he banned all companies from selling advanced chips to China. Not only this, he also asked other global companies that use U.S. semiconductor technology to stop selling advanced chips to China. The U.S. has approved billions of dollars in investments in its own chip manufacturing companies. They have made a deal with Taiwan's biggest manufacturer, TSMC, to build their plants in the U.S. It was all a part of the plan to make sure that the U.S. stayed ahead of everyone else in the semiconductor race. The U.S. tactics have fueled a conflict between the two countries. China has always wanted to reunite with Taiwan, even threatening invasion at a time, whereas the United States has always defended Taiwan as a choke point in the global supply chain. According to research, Taiwanese companies manufacture 63% of all chips and around 92% of all advanced chips. The U.S. export controls forced Taiwan to either continue their trade with China and cut off ties with the U.S., or stop their business with China and comply with the U.S. So far, they have decided to cut off China. The feud over chips will keep increasing in the future, and more restrictions will be imposed on other countries and companies around the world. The U.S. authorities have agreed with Japan and the Netherlands to tighten the screws on the export of microchips to China. One of the main suppliers of products is the Japanese company Tokyo Electron, and another is the Dutch firm ASML. All of this will surely affect China's supply chain, but if they develop a supply chain of their own, it will be very tough to stop them in the upcoming decades. What are your thoughts on the semiconductor war? I would love to hear your opinion in the comments section. If you have reached this far and liked the video, subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you'll never miss any future updates. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care.